I always thought that everything was going right in my life. I had a good job, a home, and most importantly, a wonderful wife named Evie. She was everything to me. We had been living together for 5 years, and I sincerely believed that our love was something that was timeless. However, as I learned later, reality has a habit of being cruel and merciless. Evie had always wanted children. She talked about it from the very beginning of our relationship. I loved her and realized that sooner or later we would have to take this step. However, every time we talked about children, I felt afraid. I was afraid of responsibility, afraid of change. Maybe I wasn't ready for it. We were both busy with our careers, and it seemed to me that it was too early to have a child. One day, Evie came home from the hospital looking confused. I asked her what was wrong, but she just brushed it off, saying that everything was fine. Later that night, she said we needed to talk. Ash, I need to tell you something, she began, trying to find the right words. I went to the doctor today. He said I need to get pregnant as soon as possible. Otherwise, I may never have children. Her words hit me like a lightning bolt. I didn't know what to say. I realized that it was important to her, but I was overcome with fear. I started looking for excuses why it wasn't the right time for a child. But Evie wouldn't listen. Ash, you're not hearing me, she said, tears in her eyes. I want a baby. I want a family. I'm already 30, and I don't want to wait any longer. I tried to explain my feelings to her, but she had already made up her mind. She didn't want to wait any longer. Our relationship began to burst at the seams. She was working late more and more often, and I felt that we were becoming strangers to each other. One evening when I came home, Evie was gone. I waited for her for hours, and when she finally showed up, she wasn't alone. She came with Chuck, a man I had never seen before. He was tall, athletic, and looked way too confident. This is Chuck, Evie introduced him. He helped me with my car when I got stuck on the road. I didn't like his presence, but I decided not to make a big deal out of it. However, every day Chuck started to appear in our lives more and more. He was in our house when I was away. Evie said he was just a friend, but I started to feel something strange. One day I decided to talk to Evie directly. Evie, what's going on? Who is this Chuck? I asked. Ash, it's nothing. He's just a friend. We're just hanging out, she replied, avoiding my gaze. But I knew it was more than that. I began to suspect that there was something between them. My heart was tight with jealousy. I couldn't sleep at night thinking that Evie might be cheating on me. I tried to find evidence, but every time I tried to ask her, she just brushed me off. Our arguments became more and more frequent. Evie accused me of not understanding her, of not wanting to support her dreams of a family, and I accused her of cheating on me. She denied it, but I could see her face change every time I mentioned Chuck. One of our biggest scandals happened late at night. I told her that I knew she was cheating. She denied it at first and then eventually exploded. Okay, Ash, if you want to know the truth so badly, yes, Chuck and I did have an affair, but it was because of you. You never listened to me. You never understood me. Her words struck me to the heart. I was devastated. I didn't know what to do. I loved her, but how can you love someone who betrayed you like that? That night I decided to leave our home. I packed my things and left. I couldn't stay under the same roof as the person who betrayed me so cruelly. After I left our home, my life began to feel empty. Everywhere I went, I was haunted by memories of Evie. We had been together for 5 years, and suddenly it all fell apart. It was hard to accept that the woman I loved, whom I considered my other half, was capable of such a betrayal. I spent the first days after our breakup in complete isolation. I rented a small room in a hotel on the outskirts of the city. My only friend was the walls that surrounded me and the bottle of whiskey that was always on the table. I tried to drown my grief in alcohol, but it only made things worse. I would wake up in the middle of the night from nightmares where I would see Evie and Chuck laughing together, holding hands. One day I couldn't take it anymore and decided to call Evie. Maybe part of me was still hoping that things could be fixed. I hoped that it was just a mistake, that she would want to come back to me. But when she answered, her voice was cold and distant. Ash, what do you want? She said. You know it's over between us. I couldn't believe my ears. I expected at least some hint of remorse from her, but unfortunately, there was none. I tried to convince her, told her that we could fix everything, that we could start over. but she just sighed. Ash, I'm sorry, but I've made my choice, she said calmly. I want to be with Chuck. These words pierced me to the core. She didn't even try to comfort me or even pretend to be sorry. Her decision was final. Evie had decided to leave me for him, and all I had to do was accept that fact. The following weeks passed in a blur. I tried to pull myself together, but it was harder than I thought. I couldn't work, I couldn't eat. My friends tried to support me, but every call they made only reminded me of what I had lost. One day as I was lying on my bed, trying to find some joy in a hopeless day, I got a call from my best friend Tom. He insisted that I come out of my room and meet him. I didn't want to, but he wouldn't take no for an answer. Ash, you can't go on like this, he said. You have to get back on your feet. Let's meet and talk. Maybe it will get easier. I agreed. We met at a small bar in the city center, our favorite place. It was where we usually gathered with friends when we wanted to get away from our daily routine. But this time it was different. The bar, which used to seem like a place to relax, now only reminded me of my broken life. Tom tried to cheer me up, telling me about his new projects and the people he had met recently. But I couldn't focus on his words. My thoughts kept coming back to Evie and Chuck. Why? I suddenly asked, interrupting his story. Why did she do this to me? Tom was silent for a moment. He looked at me with sadness in his eyes. Ash, I don't know what to tell you, he said. Maybe she just wasn't happy. Maybe she needed something else. I did not want to hear it. I didn't want to hear any excuses for her. I was angry. I felt deceived, betrayed. I wanted answers, but there were none. My head was filled with questions that I would never get answers to. After my meeting with Tom, I decided to do something I had been planning for a long time, but was afraid to do. I decided to find Chuck and talk to him. I wanted to know what he saw in Evie that made her leave me. I knew it wouldn't bring my wife back, but maybe it would help me understand why my life had fallen apart. Finding Chuck wasn't hard. The town was small, and I knew a few of his friends. I found out where he lived and went there. On the way, I couldn't stop thinking about what I would say to him. Would I accuse him of ruining my life? Or would I just ask him why he decided to steal Evie from me? When I got to his house, my heart was beating like crazy. I stood in front of the door, trying to find the strength to knock. Finally, I did it. The door opened and Chuck was standing in front of me. He looked surprised to see me, but he didn't look scared or guilty. Maybe he thought I had come to apologize, or maybe he thought I wanted to fight him. But neither of these things interested me. I just wanted to understand. Chuck, I said, we need to talk. He nodded and gestured me inside. We sat down in the small living room, and I began my story. I told him how I felt, how I loved Evie, how I tried to save our marriage even when I realized something was wrong. Chuck listened to me in silence. When I finished, he looked me in the eye and said, Ash, I understand how you feel. I didn't plan this. Evie and we got close. She wasn't happy with you, and I gave her what she needed. His words hurt like a knife in my heart. I wanted to explode. I wanted to scream at him, but everything stopped inside me. Maybe he was right. Maybe I really couldn't give her what she wanted. I got up and left without a word. It hurt, but maybe it was the truth I needed to hear. I left Chuck at his house and walked away, not knowing where I was going. After meeting with Chuck, I felt even more devastated. Instead of getting answers to my questions, I was left with a feeling of even greater uncertainty. It seemed like everything in my life was falling apart, and I couldn't find a way to put it back together. I returned to my small hotel room, feeling like my soul was filled with a heavy burden. I started thinking about how my life had changed over the past few weeks. I was once happy, seemingly having everything I wanted, and now I was alone, with a broken heart and broken dreams. The next morning, I woke up to a call on my phone. It was my mom. She had heard about my situation and wanted me to come home to my parents. I hadn't seen them for several months, and that was probably exactly what I needed right now, some time away from the city to collect my thoughts. I decided to accept her offer. I packed my things, left the hotel, and headed to my parents' place. The drive was long and lonely, but I tried not to think about Evie or Chuck. I knew I needed to find a way to let it all go, and maybe this place where I grew up would help me do that. When I arrived home, my mom greeted me with a hug and my dad with a smile. They have always been there for me, and I am grateful that they were there for me when it was so hard. I told them everything that had happened. They listened attentively, without judgment, just being there for me, ready to support me at any time. Ash, life is not always fair, my mom said when I finished my story. But you are strong, and I know you can handle it. You need to find the strength to let Evie go and move on. I knew she was right, but it was easier said than done. I didn't know how to move on. All I could think about was what I had lost. And every time I tried to find some light in this darkness, I met only a wall of pain and despair. My parents offered me to stay with them for a while. I agreed, although I wasn't sure it would help me. Every day seemed endless, and I couldn't get rid of thoughts of Evie and Chuck. They were eating me up inside, not giving me a moment's peace. One evening, I decided to take a walk around the town where I grew up. It was a small, quiet town where everyone knew each other. I walked along the familiar streets, and my thoughts went back to the past. I remembered my childhood, my youth, how I met Evie. It was a time when everything seemed simple and clear, when love was carefree and the future was bright. I stopped near the old tree under which Evie and I spent a lot of time. This was where we met for the first time, where we first confessed our feelings for each other. I felt tears coming to my eyes. I allowed myself to cry, to let out all the longing and pain I had been holding in all this time. After the tears dried, I felt some relief. Maybe this was something I needed to do a long time ago. When I returned home, I felt a little better. It may not have been a victory over the pain, but it was a small step forward. My parents noticed the change in my mood and seemed pleased. They realized that it would be a long road to healing, but they were ready to support me in this. The next days, I tried to find something new to do. My father offered me to help him in the garden, and I agreed. It was a simple but effective way to distract myself. Every day we worked together on the land, planted plants, and took care of them. It was hard work, but it brought me some satisfaction. I felt like I was finally starting to live again. However, one day I received an unexpected call from Evie. She said she wanted to talk. I didn't know what to expect from this conversation, but something in her voice made me agree. We agreed to meet in a cafe in the city center. When I went inside, she was already waiting for me. She looked tired, exhausted. For the first time in a long time, I saw her so vulnerable. She started the conversation by admitting that things weren't going the way she had imagined. Ash, I made a mistake, she said, trying to hold back her tears. I thought I could be happy with him, but I'm not. He's not who he seemed to be. I regret everything that happened. I listened to her in silence. My heart was pounding in my chest. Was this what I wanted to hear? She told me that Chuck was not the man she had imagined, that he was rigid and demanding, that he was constantly controlling her and did not give her freedom. She felt trapped and didn't know how to get out of this situation. I looked at her and didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to forgive her, wanted her to come back to me, but the other part of me couldn't forget what had happened. I couldn't forget the betrayal. Evie, I finally said, sighing, I understand how you feel, but I don't know if I can ever trust you again. Betrayal is not something you can just forget. She nodded, understanding my words. She knew she had hurt me and seemed to regret it. We parted without a final decision. I left the cafe feeling even more confused. Maybe part of me still loved her, but the other part couldn't forgive her. I didn't know what the future would hold, but I knew one thing. I didn't want to live in the past anymore. After I met Evie at the cafe, I felt like I was at a crossroads. Every time I thought about her, I had mixed feelings. Part of me still loved her, remembered all the happy moments we had spent together, but the other part of me couldn't forget the betrayal. How could I trust her after what had happened? How could I build a new future on the wreckage of the past? That night, I sat in my room for a long time, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what to do next. The memory that Chuck was not who she had imagined him to be haunted me. I realized that Evie had made a mistake, that she was looking for something new and exciting, but had only found disappointment. However, could I forget her choice and all that it had brought me? The next day, I decided to meet my friend Tom. He was the only person I could turn to for advice in this situation. We met at the same bar where we had met before. Tom noticed that I looked even more depressed than usual. "What's wrong, Ash?" he asked when we sat down at a table. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I told him about our meeting with Evie, about what she had said. He listened attentively, not interrupting. When I finished, he leaned forward, looking me in the eye seriously. "Ash, I realize this is hard," he said, "but you have to decide for yourself if you can forgive her and move on with your life. You can't be stuck between the past and the future." I knew he was right, but it was easier said than done. I thanked him for his advice and decided that I needed some more time to think about it. I spent a few days alone, thinking about my life, about my relationship with Evie. I remembered our first meetings, our first dates, our first quarrels and moments of reconciliation. I realized that our marriage was not perfect, but it was real. And now I had to decide whether I could trust her again after everything that had happened. One evening, I decided to call her. I didn't know what I was going to say. I just felt that we needed to talk again. She answered almost immediately, and there was a kind of hope in her voice that I hadn't heard before. "Ash," she said quietly, "I'm glad you called." I sighed and started talking. I told her about my feelings, about how hard it was for me to cope with her betrayal, about how much it hurt me to see her with another man. She listened in silence, and I felt that she understood how much she had hurt me. "Evie, I don't know if I can trust you again," I finally said. "I don't know if I can ever forget all this." She sighed. "Ash, I know it's hard, but I'm willing to do anything to earn back your trust. I realize I made a mistake, and I'm ready to fight for us." These words took me by surprise. I did not expect her to admit her mistake so directly and sincerely. Part of me wanted to believe her, wanted to give her another chance, but another part of me couldn't forget the pain. We agreed to meet again to discuss everything. I didn't know what to expect from this meeting, but I felt that we needed to dot the I's and cross the T's. We met in the park where we used to walk together when we were young and carefree. Evie was on time, looking anxious and determined at the same time. We sat down on a bench and started talking. She told me about her life with Chuck, about how she realized she had made a mistake, that she had rushed into a decision. She admitted that she began to realize the value of our relationship only after she lost it. I listened to her and felt like a part of me wanted to hug her and tell her that everything would be fine. But another part of me was still outraged. I couldn't just forget what had happened. We talked for a long time. Every word was hard but necessary. In the end, I told her that I needed more time. I couldn't just go back to the way things were. She nodded, understanding. She knew she couldn't force me to forgive her. It had to come on its own. That night I went home to my parents, and for the first time I felt that maybe there was a light at the end of this tunnel. I didn't know if I could be with Evie again, but I knew I didn't want to live in this constant state of pain and despair anymore. I spent the next few days trying to focus on myself. I decided to go in for sports to get the negative energy out. Every morning I started running in the park, and with every step I felt like some of the weight was lifted from my shoulders. But one morning while running, I suddenly stopped. I saw Chuck. He was sitting on a bench and seemed to be waiting for me. My heart beat faster, but not out of fear. I knew this was going to be a difficult conversation, but I also knew I had to get through it. "Ash," he said as I got closer, "we need to talk." I nodded and sat down next to him. He looked confused, and it was the first time I'd ever seen him like that. "I know what you think of me, and you're right. I made a mistake by interfering in your life." I listened but didn't say anything. I wanted to hear his side of the story. "Evie didn't deserve this," he continued. "I thought we would be happy together, but I was wrong. She loved you, Ash, and I only realize that now." His words took me by surprise. I didn't know if I could believe him, but I felt he was sincere. "Why are you telling me this?" I finally asked. "Because I want you to know the truth," he replied. "I want you to know that she still loves you and that I don't want to be the reason for your breakup." I sat there, silently digesting his words. Maybe it was his way of asking for forgiveness. Maybe he really realized that he had made a mistake. But I knew one thing. I needed even more time to understand whether I could forgive and move on. After our conversation with Chuck, I felt confused. His words kept running through my mind, and I couldn't figure out what he really wanted. He seemed sincere, but how could I trust the man who had caused my heartbreak? Still, his words that Evie still loved me made me think. I spent the next few days trying to focus on work and my business. I returned to the city and started to get my schedule back on track. But the thoughts of Evie and our last conversation kept coming back to me. I realized that I couldn't just let it all go. I needed to decide something for myself to find peace in my soul. One evening, when I was sitting in my apartment, I received a message from Evie. She wanted to meet me. I didn't know if I should accept, but something in my heart told me that this could be a chance for both of us. I agreed and we arranged to meet at a cafe where we used to hang out a lot. When I arrived, she was already waiting for me. She looked tired and embarrassed, but also determined. We sat down at a table in the corner, and she started the conversation first. Ash, I know it's a lot to ask, but I want you to give me another chance, she said, looking me straight in the eye. I made a mistake, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix it. I listened to her, and different feelings struggled inside me. On the one hand, I wanted to try again, to give her that chance. But on the other hand, I still felt hurt and betrayed. Evie, I understand that you are remorseful, I began slowly, but it's going to be hard to forgive you. What you did left a deep scar. She nodded, and I saw tears form in her eyes. I know, Ash, and I'm not asking you to forgive me right away, but please give us another chance. We can start over. We can work on it. I felt my heart shrink. I loved her, and she seemed to sincerely want to make things right. Maybe this was our chance for a new beginning. Okay, I said, finally making a decision. Let's give it a try, but we have to be honest with each other. And if we fail again, this time it will be the end. Evie agreed, and we decided to try to start over. It wasn't easy. We both knew it was going to be a tough road, but we were willing to fight for our relationship. We started spending more time together, talking about everything that had happened, trying to understand where we had made mistakes. Evie told me more about her feelings, about how she felt in our marriage, and I realized that we were both to blame for what happened. She was looking for something new because she felt that our relationship had reached a dead end, and I was not paying attention. We started going to therapy to understand each other better. It was hard, but at the same time, very useful. We learned to listen to each other, to understand each other's feelings and needs. I realized how important it is to be open and honest in a relationship. But despite all our efforts, I still felt that something was wrong. Part of me still couldn't forgive the betrayal. One day during a therapy session, I finally admitted it to myself and to Evie. I want to forgive you, I said, looking into her eyes, but I don't know if I can do it completely. Every time I think about you and Chuck, I get jealous and angry. Evie leaned over to me, took my hands and said softly, Ash, I understand. I know I made a mistake, but I'm willing to wait as long as it takes for you to forgive me. Her words impressed me. She was really willing to fight for us, despite all the difficulties. And I felt that maybe I needed to give us another chance. We continued to work on our relationship, and every day I began to feel that the pain was starting to gradually subside. We started building new memories, spending more time together, trying to find what once united us again. But one day when we were out for a walk, Evie received a call. I didn't pay attention to it at first, but I noticed her face turn pale and she moved away to answer it. When she came back, she looked confused. What happened? I asked, feeling my anxiety start to rise again. That was Chuck, she replied quietly. He wants to talk to me. My hands clenched into fists. Chuck had reappeared in our lives. I felt anger begin to boil inside me. What are you going to do? I asked, trying to control my tone. I don't know, Evie admitted. I don't want to deal with him anymore, but I feel like I have to listen to him. My feelings were mixed. On the one hand, I understood that she might want to close this chapter of her life, but on the other hand, I was afraid that this call could ruin everything again. If you go to that meeting, you're risking everything we're building right now, I said. I don't know if I can go through that again. She looked at me sadly. Ash, I know, but I have to do this. Please trust me. Those words were hard for me. I wanted to trust her, but I still wasn't sure if I could do it. We agreed that she would meet with him once to close the matter once and for all. The next day I waited at home, gripped by anxiety. Every minute seemed like an hour, and every sound made me even more nervous. I didn't know what to expect from this meeting and what it could mean for our future. When Evie finally returned, I saw that she was crying. I rushed to her side, but she stepped back. "What happened?" I asked, feeling the panic start to build again. "Chuck, he said he wants me back," she answered quietly. My head was spinning. What did this mean for us? She continued, "I told him that we're done, that I want to be with you, Ash." I stood there not knowing what to say. Maybe this was the last test of our relationship, and I was ready to fight for her if she was really ready to stay with me. When Evie told me about her meeting with Chuck, I felt like I was thrown into a whirlwind of emotions. On the one hand, I was relieved that she had decided to stay with me. On the other hand, I was filled with fear that our newfound trust might be as fragile as paper. I spent the next few days thinking. I knew that we needed to rebuild our lives from scratch, but at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that this situation could happen again. What if Chuck came back again? What if Evie succumbed to his influence again? My fears and insecurities began to show in our conversations. I was irritated and withdrawn. Every little thing, every small gesture from Evie seemed suspicious to me. I thought she was hiding something, that she was still thinking about him. And every time I thought about it, my anger grew. One evening we sat down to dinner together. Evie cooked her specialty dish, spaghetti with seafood. She knew I loved this dish and tried to make our evening special. But I was too deep in my thoughts to enjoy the moment. "Ash, you're not listening to me," she said, interrupting my thoughts. "You're thinking about him again, aren't you?" I looked at her and sighed. "Yes, I am. And I can't stop thinking. You said it's over, but I still can't trust you completely. Do you realize how hard this is for me?" She nodded and I saw her eyes fill with tears. "Ash, I understand, but you have to try to forgive me. I'm doing my best to rebuild our trust, but you also have to face your pain." Her words were true, but they also fueled my anger. "Face my pain?" I exclaimed. "I face this pain every day. Every day I see you, I think about what happened, and it tears me apart." Evie started to cry, but I couldn't stop. "Do you know what Chuck told me?" I continued. "He said you were never happy with me, that I couldn't give you what you wanted." She flinched as if she'd been hit. "That's not true, Ash," she whispered. "I've always loved you. I just, I just didn't know how to deal with our problems." "And that's why you went to another man?" I exclaimed. "You destroyed our marriage because of your fears?" I knew my words were cruel, but I couldn't contain my emotions. I was too hurt to be reasonable or compassionate. At that moment, all I felt was pain and frustration. Evie got up and left the room crying. I sat at the table, feeling my anger gradually subside and be replaced by guilt. I realized that I had been unfair to her. She was trying to repair our relationship, and I was only adding fuel to the fire. The next morning, Evie packed her things and said she wanted to go away for a few days to think. I didn't stop her. Maybe we both needed time to cool down and realize what we really wanted. The days she was away seemed endless. I tried to focus on my work, but my thoughts kept coming back to her. I remembered our happy moments, our quarrels, our attempts to restore our relationship. I realized that maybe I had put too much pressure on her. She was already feeling guilty about what she had done, and I was only making her feel worse. One evening, I decided to call her. I wanted to apologize, to say that I was ready to work on myself and our relationship, but she didn't answer. I left a message on her voicemail, but I didn't get any response. I started to worry. What if she decided it would be better if we broke up? What if she decided to go back to Chuck? My thoughts became uncontrollable, and I couldn't find a place to be. A few days later, Evie finally returned. She looked exhausted but determined. She sat down across from me and looked me straight in the eye. "Ash, I've been thinking a lot," she said quietly, "and I've decided that I want to stay with you. But I can't do this anymore. I can't go on living in constant fear and uncertainty." I listened to her and felt my heart beat faster. "I understand," I replied. "I don't want to live like that anymore either. I want to work on our relationship. I want to trust you again. But it will take time." She nodded. "I'm ready to wait. But I want you to know that I will do everything I can to make you trust me again." Those words were very important to me. I knew that our road to healing would be long and hard, but I also knew that we could get through it together if we worked at it. We started spending more time together. trying to rebuild our lives. I tried to be more open, listen to her more, and criticize her less. She also tried to be more sensitive and understanding. We both knew we needed time to heal, but we also knew we were willing to fight for our relationship. But I still couldn't completely let go of my feelings of jealousy and fear, and that forced me to make a decision I would never have made before. I decided to meet with Chuck again. Maybe it wasn't the best idea, but I felt like I needed to find out something for myself. I found him at his old job, at the auto repair shop where he worked. When I approached him, he looked surprised but didn't back down. "Ash," he said when he saw me, "what are you doing here?" "We need to talk," I replied. He nodded and gestured for me to sit next to him. We sat on an old bench near the entrance, and I began. "Chuck, I'm not here to accuse you or start a fight," I said. "I just want to understand something. Why are you still trying to be a part of Evie's life?" He sighed. "I realized I made a mistake, Ash. I didn't mean to ruin your marriage. I fell in love with her, but now I see that she loves you, not me." His words were honest, and I felt he was truly remorseful, but I still had questions. "If that's the case, why are you still trying to interfere?" I asked. "I thought I might be able to get her back," he admitted, "but now I realize it's impossible. I don't want to come between you two. If she wants to be with you, I will respect that." I looked at him and felt my heart soften a little. Maybe he really wanted to fix his mistake. Maybe he realized what he had done. "Good," I finally said. "I hope you keep your word, and if you really want to be decent, leave her alone." He nodded, and I stood up to leave. I didn't know if anything would change after that conversation, but I felt like I had taken the right step. I returned home and told Eva everything that had happened. She listened to me carefully and then hugged me. "Thank you for trusting me," she whispered. "I know this is hard for you." We stood there holding each other, and I felt that maybe we were finally on the right track. We knew that there were still many challenges ahead, but we also knew that we could get through them together. After our last conversation with Chuck, I felt that maybe Evie and I were finally on the right track to rebuilding our relationship. We began to spend more time together, tried to leave the past behind and build a new life. I could feel a new intimacy beginning to emerge between us, something we had lost a long time ago. But peace and tranquility did not last long. A few weeks after our conversation with Chuck, I got a call from the police. They reported that Chuck was found dead in his apartment. The officer's words hit me like a bolt from the blue. "What? How did it happen?" I asked, feeling my heart sink in terror. "We can't say for sure yet, but it appears to be murder," the officer replied coldly. "We need you to come to the booth to talk." I couldn't believe my ears. Murder? It couldn't be true. Chuck, despite everything that happened between us, didn't deserve this, and now the police wanted to talk to me. When I told Ivy about the call, her face went pale. She immediately understood what all this could mean. "Ash, you have nothing to do with this, do you?" she asked quietly, but I saw a shadow of doubt in her eyes. "Evie, do you really think I'm capable of this?" I said, feeling resentment wash over me. "I told you that I wanted to settle our affairs. I didn't even know what happened to him." She nodded, but I noticed that her eyes were still alert. That little bit of doubt that appeared in her gaze hurt more than I could have imagined. I made my way to the station, my heart pounding with anxiety. When I got there, I was met by a detective named Smith. He was tall, with a stern expression on his face, and a cold gaze that seemed to be able to penetrate my soul. "Have a seat, mister," he began, looking down at his notes. "Ash, do you know why you are here?" I nodded. "They said Chuck was found dead, but I don't understand what it has to do with me." Detective Smith leaned forward, his gaze unrepentant. "Well, you may not know, but Chuck has been reaching out to a few of his friends lately and telling them about his encounters with you and your wife. Some of them claim that he was disturbed. He said you threatened him." I was shocked. "This is not true. Yes, we talked, but I never threatened him. I just wanted him to leave us alone." Detective Smith paused, then continued. "And yet, Mr. Ash, you were one of the last people to see Chuck alive. We found witnesses who saw you near his house that day." I started to panic. "Yes, I was there, but only to talk to him. We discussed everything and I left. I have nothing to do with his death." Smith kept looking at me as if trying to guess if I was telling the truth. Chuck was found with multiple injuries. Everything looks like he was struggling with his attacker, and there is evidence that the attacker knew him personally. I panicked. How could I prove my innocence when all the evidence pointed to me? I knew I wasn't guilty, but how could I convince the police of this? And how can I restore Ivy's trust if she also doubts me? I spent the next few days in constant anxiety. The police did not charge me, but they continued to follow me, ask questions, look for evidence. I knew they thought I was the prime suspect. Evie tried to support me, but I could see that she too was having doubts. Her doubts were manifested in small things. She avoided my gaze, tried not to be alone with me. I knew it wasn't just affecting our trust, it was destroying it. One evening, as I sat in our bedroom trying to collect my thoughts, Evie came up to me. She looked worried and exhausted. "Ash," she said softly, "I want to believe you, but part of me is afraid. What if you really did it? What if you hated Chuck so much that—" Her words struck me to the very heart. I felt something break inside me. "Evie, how can you think that?" I said, feeling my eyes fill with tears. "I would never do such a thing. All I wanted was for us to be together, for us to start with a clean slate." She looked at me with pain in her eyes. "I know, Ash, I know. But if you're not guilty of anything, then who is?" This question haunted me. If I'm not guilty, then who could have killed Chuck? Who had the motive and opportunity? I couldn't find the answer, and it was driving me to despair. A few days later, I got a call from Detective Smith. He said he wanted to talk to me again. When I arrived at the station, he looked serious and focused. "Ash," he began, sitting down across from me, "we have new evidence. We found fingerprints at the crime scene that don't belong to you or Chuck." My heart beat faster. "So what does that mean?" I asked, trying to understand. "That means you might not have been the only one who saw Chuck the last day," he replied. "We are continuing our investigation, but for now you are no longer the prime suspect." I felt a huge stone fall from my shoulders. It was the first ray of hope in recent days, but at the same time I understood that this was not the end. We still didn't know who killed Chuck or why. When I got home, I told Ivy everything. She looked relieved, but her eyes were still full of anxiety. "What now?" she asked. "Now we have to wait for the results of the investigation," I replied, "and hope they find the real culprit." Despite our best efforts, Chuck's shadow still hung over us. But now I felt we had a chance. A chance to find the truth and maybe finally restore our relationship. Days passed and the police continued their investigation. They found new witnesses, new evidence, but the killer still remained unknown. I couldn't get the thought out of my head that maybe Evie knew more than she was letting on. Maybe she's still in touch with someone from her past, and that someone has her own reasons for wanting Chuck dead. The more I thought about it, the more my doubts grew. I could not be silent any longer. I decided to talk to Evie again and find out the truth once and for all. After everything that happened, I realized that Evie and I needed to have a serious talk. The suspicions that arose in me did not give me peace. I didn't know if she had anything to do with Chuck's death, but I had to make sure we were both telling the truth to each other. Our relationship was already hanging in the balance, and I didn't want to miss the chance to rebuild trust between us. One evening, as we sat together in the living room, I decided to start a conversation. "Evie, I need to ask you something," I began, trying to keep my tone calm. "I know we've both been through a lot lately, but I need to know the truth. Are you sure you don't know who would want Chuck dead?" She looked at me with unexpected fear in her eyes. "Ash, I already told you I had nothing to do with it," she replied. "I don't know who could have done it. I just want it all to end." But I couldn't let the subject go so easily. "Evie, be honest with me," I insisted. "I just want to understand what's going on. If there's something you're hiding, tell me now. This is our only chance to save our relationship." She looked at me with pain in her eyes. "I'm not hiding anything from you, Ash," she whispered. "But there's something I haven't told you about before. It's not related to Chuck, but maybe it's important." I leaned forward listening to her. "What exactly?" I asked. She took a deep breath, preparing to say what she had been holding back for so long. "I learned a bit about Chuck before we broke up," she began. "He's been doing dark things, Ash. He was in debt and had problems with some people who, to put it mildly, are not very law-abiding. Anxiety gripped me. What kind of people? I asked, feeling my heart sink. I don't know for sure, she admitted, but I knew he was in trouble. He never spoke about it directly, but sometimes hinted at it. Maybe one of them decided to get even with him. This information shocked me. The Chuck I knew was far from a saint, but I never thought he could be involved in something so serious. Maybe his death really was the result of his own doings and not someone's revenge. Why didn't you tell me this before? I asked, trying to understand her motives. I was afraid, she admitted. I was afraid that it would only complicate the situation, that you would think that I was hiding something again. And after everything that happened between us, I didn't want to lose you anymore. I was silent, considering her words. She was really afraid of losing me, and now I was beginning to understand why. All these events created an atmosphere of mistrust and fear around us. I see, I finally said. Evie, it's hard for me, but I want to trust you. We have to be honest with each other if we want to rebuild our relationship. She nodded, her face seeming slightly relaxed. I know, Ash. I want that too. However, our quiet evening conversation was suddenly interrupted by a loud knock on the door. We both shuddered and I went to open it. It was Detective Smith. Ash, Evie, we need to talk, he said sternly. We received new evidence. There are witnesses who saw a suspicious person outside Chuck's house the night he was killed, and we discovered that this person had connections with one of the criminal organizations. I felt the tension drop. Maybe this was a real killer, someone who had the motives and means to do it. We also found some documents indicating that Chuck was in debt to them, Smith continued. It changes everything. We no longer consider you a prime suspect, Ash, but we had to figure it out as soon as possible. I was relieved, but also terrified. All this was far from over. Chuck's killer was still on the loose, and now we knew he could be dangerous. What will you do next? Evie asked, her voice shaking with tension. We will continue to investigate, Smith replied, but I advise you to be careful. If this killer finds out we're on his trail, he might try to do something else. I nodded, understanding the seriousness of the situation. Now we had to be even more careful. No one knew what might happen next. When the detective left, Evie and I sat next to each other and hugged. We both felt scared, but also relieved. At least now we knew I wasn't the prime suspect. But the question of who was the real killer still remained open. That evening, we decided that we would face all the difficulties together. We promised each other to be honest, open, and support each other no matter what. This was our new beginning, and I believed we could get through it all together. For the next few weeks, we tried to live a normal life, but the shadow of what happened always remained in our minds. We were careful, always looking around, trying to be ready for any surprise. One day when we were walking in the park, Evie suddenly stopped and looked at me. Ash, I know it's going to be hard for us, but I believe we can get through it, she said. I hugged her and answered, yes, we can. I believe in us. Despite all the difficulties and trials we had to go through, I knew that our love was stronger than all obstacles. We had both made mistakes, but now we were ready to work on rebuilding our relationship and starting a new life together. We decided that we will no longer live in the past. We were ready to go forward together, overcoming all the difficulties that life would throw in our way. And Chuck's killer? The police continued to investigate, and we could only hope that justice would prevail. But as long as we were together, I knew we could overcome any challenge. And so our new life began. A life that we decided to live together, without the shadows of the past and the fear of the future. We were ready for anything, and I believe that this was just the beginning of our new journey.